And good afternoon, everyone. Dr. Woodson, Captain Bigby, Captain Elmore, CMC, the Walter Reed National Military Medical Center community, and honored guest, Rear Admiral Denise Hinton, United States Deputy Surgeon General. The Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council is honored to present a conversation with Dr. Jonathan Woodson, a celebration of Black History Month at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center. Dr. Woodson will be in conversation with our Chief of Staff, Captain Kelly Elmore. My name is Maya Magder, and I am the hospital's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer. It is with great excitement that I welcome you to today's event. Chaplain Major Bill Fry will give this afternoon's invocation.
Let's pray. Most merciful and compassionate God, we thank you today for this observance, Black History Month, here at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center. We thank you, dear Lord, for Dr. Carter Woodson's efforts nearly 100 years ago to educate our country about the contributions and sacrifices of African Americans who helped shape our nation. We pray that the dream that Dr. Martin Luther King so greatly proclaimed, that resonates in your word of a nation where people will not be judged by the color of their skin or by the content of their character, will continue its work toward a more perfect union. We are reminded by the examples in your word that you can use people to glorify you and serve their fellow man no matter what their racial or cultural background is. You call us by the words of the prophet Micah to act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. For in doing this, we show dignity and value for each other and our country. Thank you for our speaker and all participating in this observance, and especially those who work diligently to prepare for this event. We pray this in your most holy name. Amen.
Thank you, Chaplain Fry. I now invite Captain Drew Bigby, Director, Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, to address the command.
Good afternoon. What a wonderful day for Walter Reed. Thank you for joining us again. Your honors and your presence means a lot to us. Thank you all for taking some time out of your day for this incredible conversation between two amazing leaders. Every February, we honor the contributions and sacrifices of Black Americans who helped shape our nation. These achievements are an enduring part of our history. As military medical community, Black History Month is also a chance for us to honor the physicians, the nurses, the medics, who care for the ill and injured service members with compassion and courage. While there's been many Black American trailblazers throughout our country's history, Black History Month is one more chance to celebrate those accomplishments. It's also a powerful reminder that Black history is American history, and the contributions of Black Americans continue to enrich our nation. Black Americans have served in the United States military as long as there has been any military. They've often been subject to discrimination, segregation, limitation of duties, or lack of opportunities of recognition and commission. Despite these challenges, Black Americans have served with distinction and dignity, proving to be an essential part of the military and medical strength of our armed forces. While discrimination and inequality remain a constant threat, continued efforts of many service members and civilians have steadily improved the conditions and policies that govern the increased diversity of the military population. Now we get back to what we're all doing here today. Mike, please come back to the podium and introduce you to Dr. Woodson.
Thank you, Captain Bigby. I now have the honor of introducing Dr. Woodson. Dr. Jonathan Woodson is the president of the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences. He is responsible for the education and leadership development of more than 2,500 students enrolled throughout the university's 4 schools and colleges. He also oversees the military relevant research portfolio, including its 20 research centers of excellence. Dr. Woodson is the former Assistant Secretary of the Defense for Health Affairs and former Lars Anderson Professor in Management and Professor of the Practice at Boston University's Questrom School of Business. Dr. Woodson spent more than 36 years as a member of the Army Reserve, having retired this past June as a Major General and as the commander of the U.S. Army Reserve Medical Command. Captain Elmore, Dr. Woodson, thank you so much for this conversation, and I invite you to approach the stage.
And you know, thinking about being a Major General in the Army and being able to reach that pinnacle, and you continue to reach pinnacles in your career, what part of that kept you from being afraid of staying in and doing all of this work?
Well, I think it was those early experiences with family and mentors that said, you've got to have the confidence in yourself to know that you're just as good as anyone else. You've got to take advantage of the opportunities. You've got to be self-reflective in terms of understanding what you need to improve, but at the same time, you can't be defeated by others' opinions. And I think, you know, there's a well-known quote which has been attributed to Eleanor Roosevelt, which says, no one can make you inferior without your consent. And what that really says is that we've got to understand that through the course of our lives, people want to have opinions of us, but those opinions shouldn't shape really how we see ourselves and see our own potential. So it's very important to have that kind of confidence, and I think it begins with family, giving you those values, giving you that sense of self-worth that allow you to go out into the world and beat back those naysayers, if you will. Yeah.
So that makes me think of a story that we were just talking about, as far as being ready. Mm-hmm. So it sounds like your family prepared you to come out into this world and be ready for whatever the world had for you. My question is, when you got that phone call from the president's office about being ASD, can you just share that story with us?
They were looking for an Assistant Secretary of Defense, and they had interviewed a number of folks, and a couple of the folks were really very well qualified into this, but for one or more reasons, the job didn't fit their experience or full set of skills. But they said, you probably ought to call Woodson. And so I remember very well, I was out in the Berkshires visiting my daughter at a summer camp. We would go out there every year. My wife had warned me not to look at my BlackBerry at that time, you know, wives can center you and keep you disciplined. But she must have seen me twitch a little bit, so she said, okay, you can look at it for a few minutes, you know. And I turned it on and said, call the White House. And at that time, I thought, being a general officer, sometimes you get tasked to go to funerals or the like on behalf of and represent the president. I thought that was it. And so I called them back, and they said, your name has come up. Would you consider interviewing for the job of Assistant Secretary? And I said, what? You know, I said, okay, I'll play along, you know, a little bit. You know, finally I found out that it was true and it wasn't a joke, and one thing led to another. But the point of the story is that there are going to be opportunities in your lives that you may not expect, and you've got to be prepared mentally to accept those opportunities and stretch your goals in order to make those kinds of contributions.
So when you say always ready, you're always ready.
Well, yeah. Let's just say that you've got to be willing to accept those opportunities.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And just going into, as a former military physician leader and current president of a military university, what similarities and differences have you experienced in diversity, equity, and inclusion across organizations?
Well, the first thing is to understand truly as a leader why it's a force multiplier, why it's essential to your organizations. In this world, the problems that we address and encounter are so complex today that if we're all the same, there's no way we can have a hope that we're going to be able to solve those problems. We need people from different experiences, with different perspectives, with different skill sets, to bring those substantive contributions to crafting the solution, the menu of solutions that are important to the very difficult, very complex problems we encounter. So you've got to be committed. You really have got to be committed to setting the conditions that actually allows everyone in your organization to achieve their potential. And you can draw out those folks that have different experiences that can contribute to solving those problems. In public institutions, we have an extra responsibility for setting those conditions as a platform for advancement of all of our citizens and allowing them to achieve better lives within our nation. So we have an extra responsibility in public institutions to ensure that we create welcoming environments, that we have diverse populations, that we have different perspectives. So that's a very important set of responsibilities for leaders.
And that kind of leads me to my next question about the expansion of USU and where you've come from and where you are now, and how does that diversity improve what we're producing for the future of our military force?
Well, I think it begins with the last point about the issue is that we can't serve our beneficiaries, serve the active duty folks in the entire population without having a representative, a truly representative cohort of health professionals to do that. So we need to be dedicated to that. I think in a broader sense, the university, began as a medical school, and now it's become really a university in the sense that it's a graduate school of nursing, a postgraduate dental college, and a college of allied health sciences. And I particularly want to bring out the issue of the College of Allied Health Sciences, because when we initiated that idea way back when I was the assistant secretary, to me it was about giving an opportunity to the thousands of medical enlisted that we train each year and giving them a pathway forward. Before the College of Allied Health Science was really formed, we would bring large numbers, obviously, of young enlisted in. We would train them in a medical specialty, but we had no way of tracking that education to careers that they could actually do once they transitioned out of service. And so the College of Allied Health Sciences, because now we grant undergraduate degrees, gives enlisted that pathway to really substantial careers as they transition out, or even as they continue in service, but when they transition out, so that they become, they have careers and allow them to be continuing to contribute to society and to the medical workforce going forward. To me, that speaks to the American dream, right? You may have young people who come in not quite sure where they're going, but we've given them a pathway to a much greater and brighter future. And so that's very important.
So I just wanted to kind of circle back on one thing. You talked about how growing up in the civil rights movement, that your parents or grandparents experienced discrimination. And have you ever experienced discrimination? And the second part to that is seeing what our students and our people have gone through in the last, let's say, 10 years. How are you using your experience to help them see we can get through this, we can heal from this, and we can move forward to make a better nation?
Yeah, these are really important questions. So I think I began my comments by saying we're 180 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, and we still have a lot of work to do. And you can read the newspapers and you know the celebrated stories of the last several years about inequity and differential treatment by police that have led to tragic outcomes. And you realize how much more we need to do. So growing up as an African American, you know, without a doubt, there have been issues that have occurred in my life that speak to some of the same problems that we know go on in society. I can remember very well, I was a fairly good student, but I remember when I was applying to medical school, I went into this special 6-year BSMD program. There was a counselor who, when I was accepted, was startled by the fact that I had been accepted. Because, you know, as she told me at that time, there was this other majority student who she expected to get accepted, but was shocked that I had been accepted into this program. During the course of my training and development of my career, I was one of a few in many circumstances. I remember one year I applied for overseas fellowship, which was kind of usual in the program I was in. And I went to one of the professors to write me a letter of recommendation. And he said, you know, he said, John, I just don't know you that well. I don't know if I can write this letter, despite the fact that I had been on the same rotations, was doing very well in terms of the residency program. But what it turned out after the fact, I learned, is that he really felt uncomfortable writing this letter for an African American resident to go overseas to another country. It just hadn't been done. And I was part of a group of residents who were all part of a broader legacy. In other words, their fathers, mostly fathers, had been professors of surgery and prominent surgeons. So he felt uncomfortable, and that uncomfortableness was obviously with me looking different than others that he had recommended. I can remember when I was young and I would drive my father's car getting stopped. You know, that's part of my experience, and I can relate to many of the stories that go on. As I think back now, no probable cause. I hadn't run the stop sign, I hadn't run the light, I didn't have a broken tail light, but pulled over, sat on the curb, you know, and the car searched. Those, you know, the experience of the folks you read about in the newspaper is my experience as well. And despite that, you've got to understand that there are opportunities. You can't let those kinds of experiences preclude you from fully participating in what our educational institutions have to offer, what our society has to offer. You have to plow through that. It's very important.
Thank you so much for that answer and being so transparent and authentic with us in that experience. Because I know those things shape us, right? And we could allow traumas and triggers to defeat us. But like you said, we have to remain confident in what we're doing, why we're here, and who we are, and where we came from. So that being said, as the president, how are you taking those experiences and creating an inclusive environment? We've talked about the diversity we have at USU. How do we make it a more inclusive environment for our students?
Yeah, so I think the issue is I've got to be true to that experience that I've just related and understand that my job is to create the environment, again, in which all can succeed. To understand what kinds of, and we've got to examine our system to understand what kinds of structural issues exist that do not allow certain groups to succeed or feel like they can't succeed. So we have to shine light on the full spectrum of the educational process and make sure that we have support systems for all types of students, all types of learners, folks from all backgrounds. And we've got to create an environment in which different groups and different perspectives can give feedback so that we constantly improve. We've got to make sure that we live true to our values. Now, again, I grew up in the Army, so I'll reflect on a couple of values that I know all of the services have. But, you know, in the Army, we talk about the issue of loyalty, duty, respect, selfless service, honor, integrity, and personal courage. Two of those values that are most important are those of respect. And if you live up to that value, it's about the issue of understanding how everyone can contribute to success of the mission. How, in fact, you've got to rely on everyone to contribute to the success of the mission. So you've got to be able to incorporate others' opinions in how you do business and how you go forward. The second value I want to reflect on, because it's often the hardest one for us to adhere to, is that of personal courage. And that is when you see something, as Martin Luther King said, if you see something that's not right, that's morally incorrect, you've got to stand up and say something, even when it might cost you something. So something personally. So personal courage is one of those values that you've got to reflect on constantly in order to certainly mature throughout your life, being able to stand up for others. And so that's the kind of environment I certainly want to create, where everyone understands their collective responsibility for standing up, speaking up, and ensuring that we make right that which is not wrong, that which is wrong.
Right. Thank you. Question. Not that I haven't had any already. When we think about that personal courage, and it brings to mind, to whom much is given, much is required. Sometimes as people of color, Black people, African Americans, we put a lot of weight on our shoulders, and other people may put that weight on our shoulders. How do you manage the weight?
So that's an interesting question. I think there probably are two answers to it. Two answers and one caution. So the issue is accepting your responsibility. To your point about to those who have been given much is expected. So you just accept your responsibility for mentoring others, to be part of improving the process. Because it is, I think, the way you contribute and give back to society. There are some special obligations, I think, as you move up the ladder, so to speak, in which you become an important part of pointing out and correcting some of the structural inequities that exist in institutions. And that's part of this personal courage issue. You've really got to say, okay, that's not right. I remember when I was the Associate Dean for Students and Diversity at Boston University, there were clearly some things that were going on that were not correct. And we needed to make them right, both on the level of students and faculty. So sometimes you have to take on those responsibilities to be parts of committees, to be parts of institutional leadership, to make sure that you're addressing those inequities that exist. The caution is that while you're doing this, you've got to balance your career progression, because it's very easy for leaders at institution to call on you all the time. And so trying to get those things done that are important to advancing your career as a health professional, you know, getting promoted from assistant to associate professor to full professor, those kinds of things. So it's a balancing act. And the way I think you do that is you maintain your sense of self-awareness about where you're at, what kind of contributions you want to make, how you see yourself progressing and making even greater contributions in the future. But to that end, then it's important to have a cohort of individuals that keep you honest, okay? So I already mentioned my wife, okay? Please write that down, because when, no, I mentioned my wife, but family is very important in terms of keeping you honest. But you should, in fact, develop and surround yourself with a series of, how can I say, honest brokers, confidants, that will give you feedback on how well you're doing, you know, the difference between what you're perceiving and what is actually happening. It's very, very important. And so in your development, that's part of how you meet that balance, I think.
Right. Thank you for that. As a president of the university, with all the students that you have, coming from all the various backgrounds, how are we, or how are you teaching them to manage the health inequities that we are facing and are being exposed so significantly, not just in the United States, but around the world?
Yeah, so first of all, I think there's a wonderful faculty. You know, I couldn't say enough about the wonderful faculty and the leadership in the different schools and colleges. I think they're the right people who very much embrace that issue of diversity and equity, and understanding the importance of the educational environment in training good citizens who can contribute in the future. But having said that, the issue is about making sure that we examine curriculum, make sure that we're looking at the curriculum and fessing up, if you will, confessing to the biases that might be in the curriculum, right? And making sure we actually correct those kinds of perceptions that are conveyed sort of unconsciously in terms of what we're teaching. In medicine, we're in the process of looking at and re-examining a whole lot of literature that was generated in the last century that helps present and preserve biases that is just not true. And we've got to weed that out. We've got to call it out. We've got to develop a curriculum that trains our health professionals to deliver the kind of accurate and respectful care. And in this regard, one of the areas that have been neglected in medical education for a long time is how to care for the LGBTQ plus community appropriately and respectfully. We learned this a little bit back in Boston years ago. I had a good friend who championed this, but this is a kind of thing that is necessary throughout education. And as it relates to the services, it's very, very important that we be able to care for all those, everyone that contributes to the defense of this nation appropriately.
Absolutely. And as we talk about caring for those underserved or underrepresented, or I sometimes say underserviced populations and communities, specifically the Black and Brown communities, how can we bring in those students into our fold of the military health system, teach them all that we know so that they, and where do we expect them to go from there? Yeah,
that's a great question. So clearly we've got to up our game in terms of recruitment and then retention, so that we not only bring in talented individuals of color and of various groups, but we retain them as well. And of course, the pipeline is part of the issue, right? So we need to be making efforts to reach back, develop STEM connections, be visible in high schools and whatever venue is necessary to show individuals that, certainly a career in the military can be very rewarding, very dynamic, and help you get to where you want to be in life. But it's problematic. We have to do better and constantly reevaluate our efforts and how we reach out to different communities to say, this is a really exciting way to develop your career and bring folks in. But more importantly also to increase that pool, to increase those opportunities, because it is a pipeline issue that actually is becoming more severe today. So if you look at the number of particularly African American males that are entering secondary education, it's in decline rather than increasing. So what does this predict? When we run predominantly a graduate set of education programs. If we don't do something about that pipeline, well left of the situation, then we won't have enough folks to come in and make our university as diverse as it should be. So we need to be connecting with other kinds of educational groups that are helping to increase the pipeline, increase the pool.
Mm-hmm. And when we think about connecting with other groups, mm-hmm. how, as we've noticed, and probably from our famed football player in the last year, Jackson State University coach, right? Mm-hmm. That collaboration, that partnership, how can we emulate or reflect that same type of partnership, external partnership, within our military health system?
So I think we need to certainly organize what talent and leverage we have within the military health system. So there are any number of clearly senior and really accomplished individuals that we should connect with, and then let them help us connect to the outside world and increase the number of contacts. So I think it's about organizing internally so that we can do a better job of connecting externally. But part of the issue, as I said, is really this pipeline issue. We've got to work with other elements of society to ensure that we are creating greater opportunities well back into the elementary school level to increase the pool of applicants that will be available to us in the future. And I would say this is really of critical nature because we know that we're facing a healthcare workforce shortage. Some 500,000 nurses, at least 250,000 physicians, and it's both an absolute problem and a relative problem because one of the issues is that we subspecialize so much that we need to dance more specialists on the head of any one patient, if you will. And then there's an absolute problem, which is the numbers and earlier retirements and the like. So this is important not only to the military services, but it's important to the nation at large. Absolutely.
Well, we're coming almost to a close. Mm-hmm. Going to ask probably one or two more questions. Sure. One of those questions is, who do you look up to?
Oh, that's a great question, and without a doubt, when I look at who are my heroes, without a doubt, it's the folks of the civil rights era. If you think about what individuals like James Meredith, Martin Luther King, Abernathy, any of those folks went through, even the average African American whose name nobody knows, but went to the marches in Selma, went to the marches in Washington. They had a lot to lose, not only in terms of just economic losses, but their lives. They had a lot to lose. And so the civil rights, the people of the civil rights era who stood up and on whose shoulders I stand today are the true heroes. They didn't know how it was going to turn out. They didn't know how it was going to turn out on any given day, for any given event. They suffered through the fire bombings. They suffered through the hoses. If you remember that image on the Pettus Bridge when the marchers were attacked by the dogs and the fire hoses and beaten, you understand how heroic their actions were. How heroic their actions were. When you think about the 9 students who went through that gauntlet to attend Central High in Arkansas, Little Rock, Arkansas, that's heroic. And so we're constantly reminded, if you study the civil rights movement, of individuals who could not be assured of how it was going to turn out. But they stood up for something they knew was right. Didn't mean that they didn't have fear, that they weren't fearful, but in spite of that fear, they stood up, gave voice to many other individuals, and took the consequences and changed the world. So without a doubt, any number of folks, you think about the Rosa Parks, individuals who had personal courage, gets back to the value system, personal courage, stood up for right and did as Martin King said, they saw the moral injustice and spoke out and acted out. The Freedom Riders who went down to the South, the folks who sat at the counters and were beaten and arrested. These individuals were tremendous heroes, many of whom we will never know their names. We know prominent folks in the history of the civil rights movement, but there were tens of thousands of others whose names we don't know, who were equal in terms of their heroic actions, and again, whose shoulders I stand on today.
Absolutely. And my last question, you are, you come from, and you will leave a legacy. Our allyship here in this room and all over this campus, our nation, is here to support this collaboration. How can we be in support of you?
Well, thank you. I think it is about building that community that has different perspectives. And before I leave finish the answer to the question, I also want to remind individuals that as much as we point to the number of African Americans that exhibited the personal courage through the civil rights era, they were actually joined with a number of majority folks who supported those actions. So remember very well the issue after the freedom marches in the South, the 3 summer workers who went down there to organize the voting registration. 2 of them were white that were killed in that incident. So we need to understand that this is a responsibility not only for the affected group, but it's everybody's responsibility to stand up for right. So to get back to answering your question, it is about building a community of individuals who understand the same values, that commit to working for the same end game, basically, and understand their individual and collective responsibilities to build a better tomorrow for everyone. So that really is what everybody can do. That is what we can do together. It is about understanding what we do in the hospital, what we do at the university, what we can do together on certain initiatives, about what we can do to reaching out to the broader American community to build that bench that needs to come in, basically. But it all begins with a community that shares the same values.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for being here with us today.